Aaron Rodgers just dropped a bombshell that's reverberating across the entire NFL. What the legendary quarterback said about Shedeur Sanders is making waves everywhere you look. One of the greatest signal callers to ever step on the field sat down for a press conference and opened up about Shadur in a way nobody saw coming. Rodgers pulled no punches. He laid out his unfiltered thoughts on watching Shedur's evolution from Jackson State to Colorado and now to the NFL. And what he revealed is both captivating and incredibly insightful about how an all-time great evaluates the next wave of quarterbacks. This isn't some generic compliment players throw around for the media. This is Aaron Rodgers, four-time MVP, Super Bowl champion, a quarterback who's seen everything over nearly 2 decades in this league, delivering his genuine take on a rookie trying to carve out his place in the NFL. The fact that Rodgers has been actively tracking Shedur's career tells you everything about how seriously football insiders view this young man's talent and upside. Let me paint the picture, because how this conversation unfolded is actually fascinating. Rodgers was handling his typical media obligations, answering questions about his team, upcoming matchups, and various NFL storylines, when a reporter asked about facing the sons and relatives of players he battled against or alongside earlier in his career. Rodgers acknowledged he's at that stage where he's been around so long that he's now facing the next generation, the children of former teammates and opponents. He brought up Antoine Winfield Jr. in Tampa, whose father he competed against for years. He mentioned Chris Jenkins' son, now playing in the league. Then the conversation shifted to Shedeur Sanders, son of Deion Sanders, who Rodgers faced back in 2005 when he was a young backup for the Packers and Deion was wrapping up his Hall of Fame career with the Baltimore Ravens. Rodgers shared a memorable story from that Monday night game in Baltimore, where he entered the game with the Packers already getting demolished, down 41-3. He recalled having a great exchange with Deion between the third and fourth quarters and joked that he's proud he didn't throw an interception to primetime, even though the Packers ended up losing 51-3. That humility and sense of humor from Rodgers, acknowledging a blowout loss from nearly 20 years ago, demonstrates the perspective and self-awareness that's made him one of the most respected figures in NFL history. But then Rodgers pivoted from discussing Deion to discussing Shadur, and this is where things became really compelling. Rodgers said something incredibly revealing that many people are going to miss.
I've followed Shedur's career. I mean, any football fan that watched him go from Jackson to Boulder, and that being kind of a former Pac-12 school, obviously was pulling for him. And, there's a tough draft slide, obviously much longer wait than mine was. But it seems like he's, been patient and worked on his craft, and he's been playing pretty good the last few weeks.
Think about the significance of that for a moment. Aaron Rodgers, one of the most in-demand figures in professional sports, someone juggling his own career, his own team preparation, his own game planning, has been making time to follow a college quarterback's journey from an HBCU to a Power 5 program and now into the NFL. That's not something Rodgers does casually for every young quarterback entering the league. He's not sitting around studying film of every draft prospect or every rookie starter. The fact that Shadur captured Rodgers' attention and held it throughout his entire career trajectory speaks volumes about what Rodgers sees in him. Rodgers is recognized as one of the most brilliant football minds in the game, someone who understands quarterback play at a level few ever reach. When someone of that caliber tells you he's been following a young quarterback's career, you need to listen carefully, because it means that player possesses something special. Rodgers went on to say that any football fan who watched Shadur progress from Jackson State to Boulder understood his talent and his journey. He mentioned being a former Pac-12 quarterback himself at Cal, giving him extra motivation to watch Colorado and Shadur compete in that conference. Rodgers said he was pulling for Shadur, a remarkable admission when you consider the source. Here's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, someone who gains nothing from publicly backing a young player trying to prove himself, and he's telling the world he was rooting for Shadur to succeed. That's not just professional courtesy, that's authentic respect and admiration for what Shadur accomplished at the college level. Remember, Shadur led Jackson State to an undefeated season and a SWAC championship. Then he followed his father to Colorado and completely transformed a program that had won one game the year before his arrival. In his first season in Boulder, Colorado jumped from the worst Power 5 team in the country to 5 wins and national relevance, with Shadur putting up numbers that landed him in Heisman Trophy conversations. Then Rodgers addressed what might be the most controversial and painful chapter of Shedur's NFL journey, the draft. Rodgers acknowledged Shadur experienced a brutal draft slide and noted it was obviously a much longer wait than mine was. This statement carries serious weight for multiple reasons. First, Rodgers himself experienced draft heartbreak, falling to the 24th pick in 2005, when many projected him to go much higher, possibly even first overall. Rodgers has discussed many times over the years how devastating that draft day was, sitting in the green room, watching quarterback after quarterback selected ahead of him, feeling overlooked and disrespected. So when Rodgers talks about Shedur's draft slide, he's speaking from lived experience about what that feels like and how challenging it is to process that disappointment on what should be one of your greatest days of your life. The second, and perhaps even more revealing, Rodgers didn't sugarcoat it or make excuses. He acknowledged that Shedur's wait was far longer than his own, falling to the 5th round versus falling to the late 1st round. That's a massive difference. Going from a guaranteed 1st-round contract and the expectations of being a day 1 pick to being a 5th rounder that numerous teams passed on multiple times. But here's where Rodgers' comments become really intriguing and where I believe he's subtly communicating something deeper than surface-level analysis. The host of the show said, obviously, he shouldn't have failed to the 5th round, but we all know that was orchestrated by the league. We all know that. Now, Rodgers didn't directly engage with that conspiracy theory angle, but the fact that he brought up the draft slide and emphasized how long Shadur had to wait suggests he might not entirely dismiss the notion that something felt off about how that draft unfolded. Whether you believe there was some coordinated effort to drop Shedur's stock, or whether you think it was simply standard draft evaluation and team decision-making, the objective facts are striking. A quarterback who won everywhere he played, posted historic numbers, demonstrated elite arm talent, showcased mobility and athleticism, displayed leadership and composure, and came from one of the most football-savvy families in the sport's history, somehow fell to the 5th round. That doesn't compute for a lot of people, and Rodgers acknowledging the difficult slide validates that confusion. What Rodgers said next might be the most crucial part of the entire interview from Shedur's perspective. He said that despite the tough draft experience, it seems like he's been patient and worked on his craft, and he's been playing pretty good the last few weeks. Let's break down this statement because it's loaded with meaning. First, Rodgers praised Shedur's patience. In the NFL, especially for young quarterbacks, patience is everything. The league is faster, more complex, more physically demanding than anything they faced in college. There's a steep learning curve, and how a player handles that curve, how they respond to early struggles and setbacks, often determines whether they succeed or flame out at this level. Rodgers is noting that Shadur hasn't panicked, hasn't shown frustration publicly, hasn't lost his composure or confidence. That's massive, especially for someone who endured the disappointment of falling to the 5th round and then had to sit and wait for his opportunity to start. Many players in that situation would turn bitter, would start complaining about lack of reps or not getting a fair shot. Shadur hasn't done any of that, and Rodgers recognizes and respects that approach. Second, Rodgers said Shadur has worked on his craft. This is telling because it suggests Rodgers has been watching not just Shedur's game performances, but his development process. You can't truly know if someone is working on their craft unless you're paying close attention to how their technique, footwork, decision-making, release, all the technical elements of quarterback play are evolving over time. The fact that Rodgers can make this observation means he's been studying Shedur's game beyond just casual viewing. He's been watching with a coach's eye, with a quarterback's eye, evaluating the details that separate good quarterbacks from great ones. And what Rodgers is communicating is that he sees improvement. He sees a young quarterback putting in the work and getting better. Coming from someone of Rodgers' stature and expertise, that's an incredibly powerful endorsement. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Rodgers said Shadur has been playing pretty good the last few weeks. This might sound like modest praise. Pretty good isn't exactly elite or phenomenal, but context is everything here. Rodgers is famously measured and deliberate with his words. He's not prone to hyperbole or excessive praise, especially when evaluating other quarterbacks. So when Rodgers says a fifth-round rookie playing behind the worst offensive line in the farm league with receivers struggling to create separation is playing pretty good, that's actually high praise. Rodgers understands better than almost anyone how difficult the quarterback position is in the NFL, how many things need to align for a quarterback to look good, how dependent quarterbacks are on their supporting cast and coaching. For him to watch Shadur in Cleveland's dysfunctional offensive situation and come away thinking he's playing pretty good sends a strong positive signal about Shedur's talent and potential. What I find particularly fascinating about Rodgers' comments is what he didn't say. He offered no criticism. He didn't qualify his praise with but statements. He didn't suggest Shadur needs to work on this or that. For someone as analytical and detail-oriented as Rodgers, the absence of criticism is almost as telling as the presence of praise.
If Rodgers saw fundamental flaws in Shedur's game, mechanical issues that concerned him, decision-making problems that raised red flags, he probably would have mentioned them, perhaps couched in diplomatic language, but mentioned nonetheless. The fact that his entire assessment was positive, from following his career, to pulling for him, to acknowledging the tough draft, to praising his patience and work ethic, to saying he's playing well, suggests Rodgers genuinely believes Shadur has what it takes to succeed in this league. The broader context of this interview matters too. Rodgers was fielding questions about various topics, dealing with issues around his own team, discussing player conduct and fan behavior, talking about different offensive formations and personnel groupings. The Shadur question could have been a throwaway moment, something Rodgers answered quickly before moving on. Instead, he engaged thoughtfully, shared specific memories about facing Deion, acknowledged following Shedur's career with clear interest, and offered substantive analysis of what he's seen from the young quarterback. That level of engagement tells you this wasn't just Rodgers being polite or saying what he thought people wanted to hear. This was genuine interest and genuine respect from one quarterback to another across generations. There's also something poetic about the connection between Rodgers and Shedeur through Shedeur Sanders. Rodgers faced Deion at the tail end of Primetime's legendary career, one Hall of Famer passing the torch to another. Now, nearly 20 years later, Rodgers is watching Deion's son try to establish himself in the NFL, creating a full-circle moment that connects different eras of football. Rodgers clearly has affection and respect for the Sanders family legacy, and that respect extends to Shadur. When someone like Rodgers, who has seen and competed against the absolute best players in NFL history, looks at Shedeur Sanders and sees something worth following, worth praising, worth believing in, that carries significant weight. The part of Rodgers' answer about dealing with adversity is also directly relevant to Shedur's situation. Even though Rodgers was technically answering a different question about a young player on his own team, Rodgers discussed how the mental side of being a young player in the NFL is crucial, not just learning the X's and O's, but handling adversity. He said adversity happens to everybody at every age throughout your entire career, but it's tougher when you're younger because it feels more ominous and foundational, like it can crack your stability. That's exactly what Shadur has been navigating, the adversity of falling to the fifth round when you believed you should have been a first-rounder, the adversity of being thrust into a starting role behind a terrible offensive line with limited weapons, the adversity of facing constant criticism from media members like Jason Lloyd, who use questionable stats and cherry-picked data to tear you down, the adversity of trying to prove yourself while dealing with all the external noise about your father, about nepotism, about whether you're actually good or just benefiting from your last name. All of that represents exactly the kind of foundational adversity Rodgers was describing, and based on everything we've seen, Shadur has handled it with remarkable maturity and mental toughness. What's interesting is that Rodgers himself is the perfect case study in how to respond to draft disappointment and channel it into motivation. Rodgers fell to 24th overall, sat behind Favre for 3 years, dealt with questions about whether he'd ever get his chance, and then, when he finally became the starter, he became one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. He turned that draft slight into fuel, using it to drive his preparation and performance. He's discussed many times over the years how that experience shaped him, how it gave him a chip on his shoulder that he carries to this day. When Rodgers looks at Shadur, he probably sees echoes of himself in that situation, a talented quarterback who fell further than he should have and now has to prove all the doubters wrong. That's a narrative Rodgers understands intimately, and it's likely part of why he's been following Shedur's career with such interest. The other element of Rodgers' comments that stands out is his acknowledgement that Shadur is still a rookie in many ways, learning the NFL game, developing his skills, figuring out how to succeed at this level. That's important context that often gets lost in the hot-take culture of sports media. Everyone wants to make definitive judgments about players immediately, to declare them franchise saviors or busts based on a handful of games. But Rodgers, with the wisdom of someone who's been in the league for 2 decades, understands that quarterback development takes time. Even the greatest quarterbacks struggle early in their careers as they adjust to the speed and complexity of the NFL game. Peyton Manning threw 28 interceptions as a rookie. Troy Aikman went 0-11 as a rookie starter. Josh Allen looked lost his first couple years before breaking through. The list goes on and on. Rodgers himself needed 3 years of holding a clipboard and learning before he was ready to start. So when he says Shadur is still developing but playing pretty good and working on his craft, that's the perspective of someone who understands the long view of quarterback development. From Shedur's perspective, having Aaron Rodgers publicly endorse him and speak positively about his career has to be incredibly validating. Imagine being a 22-year-old rookie trying to establish yourself in the NFL, dealing with constant criticism and doubt, and then one of the all-time greats comes out and says he's been following your career, he was pulling for you in college, he respects how you've handled adversity, and he thinks you're playing well. That's got to be a massive confidence boost. It's also the kind of endorsement that carries weight throughout the league. When Rodgers speaks, people listen. Coaches, general managers, other players, and media members all respect Rodgers' opinion on quarterback play because he's one of the best ever to do it. So having Rodgers' stamp of approval, even in this relatively casual press conference setting, elevates Shedur's profile and credibility in ways that statistics and highlight reels cannot. The contrast between how Aaron Rodgers talks about Shadur versus how someone like Jason Lloyd talks about him is stark and telling. Rodgers, who actually understands quarterback play at an elite level, who has studied the game for decades, who knows what it takes to succeed at the position, watches Shadur and sees talent, potential, work ethic, patience, and solid play. Lloyd, a media member with an agenda and questionable stats, watches Shadur and sees the worst quarterback in modern NFL history. Which assessment do you think is more credible? Which person's opinion should carry more weight? The answer is obvious. Rodgers has no reason to lie about what he sees in Shadur. He doesn't benefit from propping up a Browns rookie quarterback. If anything, he'd probably get more attention from being critical or dismissive, since that's what generates clicks in today's media landscape. But instead, he chose to be honest and positive because that's what he genuinely sees when he watches the tape. The fact that Rodgers specifically mentioned watching Shadur at Jackson State is also significant. Many NFL players and evaluators didn't pay much attention to Shadur when he was at an HBCU because there's still bias in this league about the level of competition at historically black colleges. But Rodgers didn't have that bias. He watched Shadur dominate at Jackson State and recognized the talent regardless of what conference he was playing in. Then he watched him move to a Power 5 school and continue to produce at a high level against much better competition.
That consistent production across different levels, different conferences, different supporting casts told Rodgers what he needed to know about Shedeur's abilities. The talent is real, the skills translate, and the player can succeed regardless of circumstances. That's what genuine evaluation looks like, as opposed to the lazy narratives about him only succeeding because of his dad or because of the level of competition. Another interesting aspect of Rodgers' comments is the timing. He made these statements during the current NFL season, while Shadur is actively playing and trying to establish himself. Rodgers could have waited for the off-season or until Shadur had more games under his belt, or until there was less scrutiny on the young quarterback. But he chose to speak up now when Shadur needs positive voices in his corner, when he's dealing with critics and doubters, when public perception is still being formed. That suggests Rodgers wanted to use his platform and credibility to help shape that narrative in a positive direction. Whether that was intentional or just Rodgers being honest when asked a question, the effect is the same. One of the game's legends is vouching for the next generation, creating a connection across eras that can only help Shadur as he continues his NFL journey. The parallels between Rodgers' career arc and where Shadur is right now are worth exploring in more detail. Both quarterbacks entered the league with questions about their draft stock. Both had to deal with being passed over by multiple teams. Both had to prove themselves in difficult situations. Both had to overcome doubters and critics who didn't believe in them. Rodgers turned his draft disappointment into a Hall of Fame career, using that chip on his shoulder as motivation to outwork and outperform everyone who passed him on. Will Shadur follow a similar path? It's too early to know for certain, but the early signs are promising. He has the talent, he has the work ethic, he has the mental toughness, he has the pedigree and coaching from his father, and now he has the public endorsement of one of the greatest quarterbacks ever. Those are all ingredients for success if they come together the right way.
What's also worth noting is that Rodgers didn't just offer generic praise like he's a good player or he has potential. He provided specific observations about Shedur's patience, his work ethic, his recent play. That specificity suggests Rodgers has actually been paying close attention and forming informed opinions based on what he's seen. This wasn't just a polite response to a question about another quarterback. This was genuine analysis from someone who knows what he's watching and has taken the time to watch it carefully. In an era where so much sports commentary is surface-level hot takes and uninformed opinions, having someone like Rodgers provide thoughtful, specific analysis is refreshing and valuable. The broader implication of Rodgers' comments is that people within football, the players and coaches who actually understand the game at a high level, see something in Shadur that some media members and casual observers are missing. The Jason Lloyds of the world can cite their cherry-picked EPA stats and their anonymous sources all they want, but when actual Hall of Fame quarterbacks are saying they've been following your career and you're playing pretty good, that tells you whose evaluation you should trust. Football people see the talent in Shadur. They see the potential. They see the work ethic and the improvement. They understand the difficulty of the situation he's in, and they evaluate him accordingly. That's the assessment that matters, not the hot takes from media members with agendas. For Browns fans, hearing Aaron Rodgers speak positively about their young quarterback has to be encouraging. After years of quarterback disasters and disappointments, after the Deshaun Watson trade blew up in their faces, after cycling through dozens of quarterbacks over 2.5 decades, they finally might have found their guy. And one of the all-time great quarterbacks is telling you he's been watching, he's impressed, and he sees the potential. That's not a guarantee of success, but it's a strong indicator that the Browns might be on the right track with Shadur. At minimum, it suggests they should be patient, should continue developing him, should give him the weapons and offensive line he needs to succeed, and should tune out the noise from critics who don't know what they're watching.